Ava arrived in the small town on a cold night, wrapped in a worn-out coat, and carrying a backpack that seemed to hold more than just her belongings. The biting wind announced her arrival as she walked down the narrow streets, always alert to every shadow, every glance that could recognize her. Her face reflected the weight of a past she couldn't leave behind, and her evasive gaze betrayed the constant vigilance she maintained over the world around her. Her dark hair fell over her shoulders, framing a face marked by exhaustion and restrained fear. Her steps were light, avoiding staying too long under the streetlights. She had chosen that town precisely because of its tranquility, because it was a place where people didn't ask many questions and strangers could pass unnoticed. At least, that's what she hoped. She carried only the essentials, avoiding drawing attention with bulky luggage or careless gestures. Her money was limited, and every choice had to be made with caution. She found shelter in a small inn at the end of the main street, where the owner, an elderly woman with a gentle gaze, did no more than what was necessary to register her: a false name, an advance payment, and a key handed over without questions. As she crossed the door of the modest room, Ava let out a quiet sigh. The simple walls and narrow bed represented a luxury she hadn't been able to afford in a long time. But the relief didn't last. Reality persisted, whispering in her mind that this peace was only temporary. Her past was too close, and any slip-up could ruin everything. The next morning, she avoided the busy streets and kept away from curious eyes. She needed to find a job, something discreet, with no need for documents or explanations. She wandered aimlessly for a while, memorizing shortcuts and exits. Every corner represented a potential threat, and every unfamiliar face could be a lurking danger. Ava's life wasn't made of certainties, only desperate attempts to remain invisible. And in that town forgotten by time, she needed, more than ever, to disappear without a trace. Daniel knew every street, every face, and every silence in that town forgotten by time. For years he had worked as the town's sheriff, wearing the uniform with the same weight as the look in his eyes. The past had left invisible scars, memories that would never fade, and although the routine kept him steady, something inside him remained restless, as if always waiting for the moment when destiny would bring him something new, something that would challenge his experience. The days followed a pattern. The station, located in the center, was a stopping point for minor incidents and occasional disputes between residents. Nothing there required much effort, but Daniel never underestimated the calm. He knew that many times, danger hid in the details, in faces that seemed ordinary, in gestures that went unnoticed by the less attentive. Time had shaped his instincts. Observant and meticulous, he noticed when something didn't fit. He knew the inhabitants and their habits well, and any change, no matter how small, caught his attention. That's how he had survived for so many years in a profession that tested not only patience, but the endurance of those who chose it. Outside of work, he lived a quiet life. His simple house, organized with almost mechanical precision, reflected his own way of living. There was no room for distractions or for anything that took him away from the only certainty he had: his duty. Some nights were filled with the biting silence of the past, others with accumulated fatigue. Daniel wasn't looking for redemption, nor did he believe he would ever find complete peace. But, even without realizing it, his routine was about to change, and it would all start with the silent presence of a stranger who carried a secret in her eyes that was hard to ignore. The town seemed to have stopped in time. Narrow streets, lined with old buildings, formed a maze of memories preserved by silence. The worn facades bore marks of time, while dusty windows revealed the calm of local commerce. Few people walked without haste, accustomed to the predictable routine of a place where every face was familiar, and any novelty soon became the talk of the town. In the center, a modest square gathered wooden benches and trees whose leaves danced to the rhythm of the wind. A small bandstand, a witness to forgotten events, stood firm at the heart of the town. There, elderly people talked about the same old things, while children ran freely across the uneven stone sidewalks. The station occupied a discreet building, with no fanfare. Its interior exuded the austerity of a place where rules were followed without question. There was no room for mysteries or sudden changes, only the methodical fulfillment of daily duties. On the outskirts, tranquility took on a different tone. Dirt roads led to vast fields, where the horizon blended into the sky without haste. Small farms endured the passage of time, supported by calloused hands and the determination of those who had never known another life. The night transformed the scenery. The few lights that remained on cast long shadows, while the darkness covered the alleys and narrow streets. The wind blew harder, bringing with it a cold that pierced through clothes and settled in the bones. The town slept early, immersed in almost total silence. But for those who carried secrets, the night was never a safe refuge. Ava kept a low profile in the first few days. She avoided drawing attention, chose less crowded paths, and only went out when necessary. But the town, small and used to routine, soon noticed her presence. Strangers didn't go unnoticed for long, and even without intention, glances began to follow her with silent curiosity. It was on a cloudy morning that the first mistake happened. She walked hurriedly down the nearly empty streets when a patrol passed slowly. Her instinct made her lower her head, but the sudden movement caught Daniel's attention. A small gesture, but enough to awaken the trained perception of the sheriff. He watched without hurry, the tense posture, the eyes always alert to her surroundings, the way she avoided staying too long in the same spot. That wasn't just shyness or discomfort from someone arriving in a new place. There was something more. Later, at the local market, Ava tried to maintain her composure while picking up some groceries. Her fingers trembled as she counted the money, and a mistake caused some coins to fall to the ground. As she bent down to pick them up, she felt a chill. Someone was watching her. Daniel, from a distance, simply waited. Time had taught him that certain answers came without the need for questions. And in that moment, facing that unknown young woman who even avoided breathing deeply, he knew he had found a puzzle he couldn't ignore. The fine rain began to fall as Ava left the market. The bags hung from her hands, and the cold wind made the walk back even longer. The thin coat offered little protection against the unstable weather, but that was the least of her problems. The feeling of being watched persisted, a silent discomfort that made her quicken her pace without drawing too much attention. She turned a narrow corner and continued down the wet sidewalk. The streets were almost deserted, with only a few lights on in windows indicating life inside the houses. She felt a chill as she heard regular footsteps behind her. The rhythm was constant, not too close, but not far enough to be ignored. She kept calm, but her mind was working quickly. Any slip-up could cost her dearly. When she reached an intersection, she hesitated for a second before moving forward. It was at that moment that a firm voice called her by the name she had given at the inn. The impact of that call traveled through her body like a shock. She turned slowly, controlling her expression. The man in front of her didn't show any aggression, but his posture indicated experience. The badge on his chest confirmed what she had already suspected. He was the town's sheriff. Daniel kept a few steps away. His watchful gaze examined every detail, and Ava felt that any attempt at disguise would be useless. He didn't seem to be in a hurry, but he also didn't seem willing to ignore his suspicions. The wind blew stronger, bringing with it the scent of wet earth. Ava gripped the handles of the bags more tightly. There was nowhere to run without raising even more suspicion. The town, which had seemed like a refuge, now felt like a trap closing around her. The following days passed in an unstable balance between vigilance and distance. Daniel remained attentive, not directly approaching her, but his presence seemed always close. Ava noticed his figure from a distance, sometimes at the police station, other times in the square, or crossing the street while she passed by. It wasn't an overt pursuit, but it also wasn't coincidence. She tried to follow her routine without changes. She bought only the essentials, avoided crowded places, and limited her interactions to the bare minimum. Still, the small town didn't allow for complete isolation. The little market, the bakery, the boarding house where she was staying, each space required a word exchange, curious glances, and occasionally questions she tried to sidestep with brief answers. Daniel watched without interfering. His instinct told him that Ava carried more than just the discomfort of a stranger. There was something in her gestures, the way her eyes assessed the surroundings, as if she was measuring every possible escape route before even entering any place. An unexpected storm brought the first real moment of closeness. Ava was returning from the market when the rain poured down without warning. Within seconds, the streets were flooded with puddles, and the cold winds made the return even harder. Her hurried steps turned into an involuntary run, and as she turned a corner, she stumbled on the slippery ground. Before she could react, firm hands grabbed her arm, preventing a harsh fall. The touch was brief, but the sensation lingered. Daniel helped her regain her balance and stepped back immediately, staying alert for any reaction. Ava muttered a quick thank you and continued on her way, feeling the weight of his gaze on her back. After that episode, the casual encounters became inevitable. A discreet greeting on the street, a glance exchanged at the bakery, the feeling that somehow a silent bond was starting to form. Daniel didn't press with questions, but his constant presence showed that he wasn't going to lose sight of her anytime soon. Ava tried to ignore the feeling that, little by little, her isolation was beginning to unravel. But something inside her knew that the barrier she had between herself and others wouldn't last much longer. Days passed, and Daniel's unease became more and more evident. Ava wasn't just a young woman trying to start over, as she claimed in the few casual conversations they'd had. There was something in her past that made her look over her shoulder often, measure each word, and avoid any kind of closeness. Experience had taught Daniel to recognize when someone was hiding more than they were willing to admit, and Ava fit that profile perfectly. He was determined to find out more about her. He started a discreet investigation, without involving the police team. First, he checked city entry records, but found only basic information at the boarding house where she was staying. No official documents, just a name and a prepaid payment for a few weeks. It wasn't common, but it wasn't illegal either. He sought information among local merchants, subtly asking about the new resident. Everyone seemed to have the same impression, a reserved, polite young woman, but always restless. She had no family around and didn't seem interested in socializing. Her gaze always seemed distant, as if ready to leave at any moment. Feeling the need for something more concrete, Daniel decided to access databases from other cities. He scoured police records, missing persons lists, and news of recent crimes that could have a connection to Ava. For hours, he analyzed information without finding anything relevant, until a detail caught his attention. An old police report, filed in a neighboring town, mentioned her name, not as a suspect, but as someone involved in an unresolved case. While Daniel advanced in his investigation, Ava began to feel the noose tightening. Her instincts told her she couldn't stay there much longer. The town, which had initially seemed like a safe haven, now seemed too small to hide secrets. She needed to leave before it was too late. She tried to plan her departure without raising suspicion. She avoided drastic changes to her routine, but began to observe possible escape routes. She identified times when the streets were emptier, noticed less visible paths, and studied ways to leave without leaving traces. On the chosen night for her departure, the town was engulfed in silence. The cold wind blew between the houses, and the streetlights flickered occasionally. With a light backpack, she moved through the shadows, staying out of reach of curious eyes. But as she neared the road, a car parked on the shoulder made her hesitate. There was no one visible, but the mere presence of the vehicle was enough to make her pause. Before she could move away, a headlight flickered from a distance. Another car was approaching slowly, and Ava felt a shiver run down her spine. The survival instinct screamed for her to retreat. She quickly returned to the town, feeling her heart race. Her plan had failed. In the following days, a new fear began to haunt her. She started noticing strange movements, shadows that seemed to follow her from a distance. The danger she had been running from wasn't as far away as she had imagined. The past, which she had tried to bury, had found her trail. Daniel noticed the change. Ava seemed even more alert, her eyes always analyzing the environment, as if waiting for something to happen at any moment. Her hands trembled slightly when holding small objects, and her steps became quicker. Amidst this growing tension, the barrier between the two began to crumble. The distance Ava had tried to maintain became harder and harder to keep. Daniel, despite his suspicions, no longer saw her just as a mystery to be solved. There was something about her that awakened an instinct to protect, one that went beyond professional duty. On a rainy afternoon, while walking through the market, Ava suddenly felt dizzy for a moment. The fatigue, stress, and lack of rest were taking their toll. Before she could react, her legs gave out for a moment. Daniel was nearby and caught her arm before she fell. It was a simple gesture, but full of meaning. For the first time, Ava didn't immediately pull away. She felt the warmth of his hands supporting her weight, and for a brief moment, allowed herself to breathe. Daniel said nothing, simply waiting for her to regain her balance before letting her go. The connection between them grew silently, marked by subtle gestures and an understanding that didn't require words. Ava still carried the fear of trusting, but little by little, she began to realize that maybe she didn't have to face everything alone. Danger was approaching, but this time, she wasn't completely helpless. Nightfall settled over the small town, and an unsettling silence hung in the air. The streets, lit only by the faint glow of the streetlights, seemed deserted, but Ava knew something was wrong. The weight of danger was almost tangible, a silent warning that she was no longer safe. The time she gained by running had run out. She felt the first sign as she left the boarding house. A black car parked across the street. The engine off, the windows dark, but there was someone inside. The survival instinct made her quickly change direction, pretending not to notice the strange presence. Her heart raced, and the feeling of being watched grew with each step. She tried to blend into the quiet movement of the town, walking without looking back. But when she turned a corner, a shadow appeared in front of her. The shock froze her movements for a second. She didn't need to see the face to know she had been found. She tried to retreat, but another man appeared behind her. The way was blocked. The muffled sound of footsteps on the sidewalk made her chest tighten. They were surrounding her. Her eyes searched for an escape, but everything seemed too closed in, too dark. One of the men moved forward, and Ava instinctively reacted. She ran for the only open space, forcing her way through the narrow alleys. The sound of muffled voices and quick steps behind her confirmed that it wasn't an impromptu chase. They had come prepared. The uneven ground made running difficult, but Ava didn't stop. Her body moved by pure reflex, dodging obstacles, searching for any way out. Each corner she turned felt like a never-ending maze, until a wall appeared in front of her, blocking her escape. The air grew heavy. The sound of footsteps slowed, and the certainty of imminent danger made her skin crawl. She turned, pressing her back against the wall. The men emerged from the shadows, their faces partially concealed, but their eyes locked on her. Ava clenched her fists, feeling desperation mix with anger. She would not let them take her back, not after everything she had gone through. But before any movement could be made, a deep voice echoed in the darkness. The sound of a car screeching to a halt broke the silence. A beam of light illuminated the alley, and the men hesitated for a moment. It was enough time for Ava to recognize the figure emerging from the shadows. Daniel was there, and this time, he wouldn't let them take Ava. Time seemed to stop as Daniel watched Ava, who was at the mercy of her pursuers. The tension in the air was thick, and the sound of his own heartbeat mixed with the soft voices of the men in front of him. Daniel knew he was facing a choice that would change everything. Duty as a sheriff called to him, and he knew he should carry out his mission. But when he looked at Ava, something inside of him broke. She was there, her eyes scared, but determined. She had already faced so much to get here, to hide, to protect her secret, but the chase she had been trying to avoid was now catching up with her, and he knew that in this moment, he could not just walk away, ignore the situation as if it were a simple incident. There was no turning back. Daniel took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the men who were approaching. He knew that, as a sheriff, he should act according to the law, that he should hand Ava over to the authorities. But his heart, filled with silent empathy, knew there was something bigger at stake here, something that could not be ignored. Ava was not just another person in an investigation. She had become something personal, a presence that brought with it a sense of urgency, a need to protect her, to keep her safe. The decision to follow his duty and enforce the law had never been easy for him. In all the years of his career, he had always put what was right above all else. But there was something unusual about Ava, something that made him question the rigid lines between right and wrong, duty, and the desire to protect. She was more than a fugitive. She was a woman with a history he did not yet fully understand, but one that seemed more important with each passing second. The dilemma tightened in his chest. A part of Daniel wanted to step away, fulfill his mission, and make sure things were handled the right way. But another part of him, perhaps the more human side, felt that his protection of Ava was something that could not be ignored. Not just because she was fragile and vulnerable in the face of imminent danger, but because something inside him was also at stake. It was more than a matter of justice. It was a matter of choice, of doing what felt right deep in his soul. The men in front of him were preparing to advance. He knew that any movement, any hesitation, could lead to something worse. But he could not allow the woman who now meant something to him to be taken, not out of mere obligation, but because he felt responsible for her in some way. Daniel looked at Ava one last time, his eyes conveying a decision already made, and with a quick motion, he moved forward. He knew that from that moment on, his life would change. He would no longer be the sheriff who followed the rules. He would be the man who would do the impossible to protect someone he had barely known until recently, but now could not imagine losing. Ava's life and his own were now intertwined, and in that moment, he knew that his choice to protect her transcended any commitment to the law. What was at stake was not just justice, it was something deeper, a connection forming before his eyes that he could not walk away from. The tension hung in the air, and the feeling that something unexpected was about to happen made each second feel heavier. Daniel and Ava were close, their fates linked by a series of events that always seemed to connect in an inexplicable way. However, none of the difficulties they had faced so far could have prepared them for what was about to be revealed. What seemed like a simple escape, a desperate attempt by Ava to flee her past, turned into something much more complex. Daniel was still absorbing the weight of his choices, struggling to balance his mission with the need to protect Ava. But when she began to speak, her voice trembling as if she knew that what she was about to say would change everything, that's when Ava made the revelation. She was running from a network much larger than Daniel could have imagined. This was not just a regular chase. Something much darker was at play. Ava was not just a woman being hunted for a past mistake. She was involved in something deeper, something that connected powerful names, and in some way, affected even the world Daniel lived in. The revelation hit him like a blow to the chest. Ava was not just running. She was being hunted by something that involved people within the very justice system, something Daniel, as a sheriff, would never have believed possible. The people he swore to protect were, in fact, the same ones behind the chaos surrounding Ava's life. The weight of Ava's words spread like fire, burning everything around Daniel. The trust he had in the institutions he worked for slowly dissolved, and a deep fear spread through his chest. The laws he had defended were being manipulated by those he trusted. He could no longer just act according to what he was taught. He needed to see beyond the surface, beyond appearances, and understand the truth behind it all. Ava, on the other hand, appeared exhausted but determined. She knew this revelation would bring more complications, but she felt there was no turning back. What she knew now was far more than just a simple secret. It was an uncomfortable truth, one that, if discovered, could bring down even the most powerful. Daniel was in shock, processing the magnitude of what he had just heard. He never imagined that the woman he was falling for would be so deeply involved in something so dangerous and intricate. He wanted to protect her, but now the responsibility was greater. He could no longer make decisions based solely on his emotions. He had to think about what was best for everyone, even if that meant fighting against those he had once considered allies. But Ava's revelation did not just shake the foundations of what Daniel believed to be true. It also changed the way he saw the world around him. He found himself at a crossroads. His duty as a sheriff, his mission as a defender of the law, was now in conflict with the desire to protect the woman he was starting to love. The game had changed, and Daniel no longer knew who he could trust. As he absorbed the gravity of the situation, Daniel realized that by Ava's side, he was not only facing the imminent danger that pursued her, but also a fight against the shadows of the very system he had sworn to serve. The truth, though painful, had been revealed, and the path ahead would be more uncertain and dangerous than he ever imagined. After a series of intense and unpredictable events, the danger that had pursued Ava finally came to an end. The battle was hard, and although the enemies had been defeated, the scars from the fight would remain. What seemed like a desperate escape had turned into a real war for survival, but the weight of the consequences now loomed over both of them. Ava, exhausted but relieved, felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. The terror of being hunted had disappeared, but she knew her life would never be the same. The revelations about the past and the power games she had faced couldn't be erased so easily. With every breath, she was reminded that her story was now irreversibly intertwined with Daniel's. Daniel, for his part, also found relief in seeing the threat distant, but his mind was in conflict. Though he had fulfilled his duty as a sheriff, many shadows lingered over what he now understood to be his own mission. The trust in the institutions he had once defended was shaken, and he wondered how he could move forward knowing what he now knew. The line between right and wrong seemed blurrier, and the idea of protecting Ava, even within his position, now took on a new meaning. They were both, in a way, free. but the freedom they had gained was not without a price. The external danger had been resolved, but now the internal consequences remained, the ones that involved their own emotions and decisions. Ava and Daniel needed to face each other, no longer with the ghosts of the past, but with the reality of their relationship and the choices they had made. Ava knew that even after the fight, her life would continue to be a minefield. The forces that had pursued her would not disappear overnight. There was much more behind the plot that involved her name, something even Daniel might not fully understand. And while she wished to start anew, the truth was that the weight of the past had become a constant shadow. Daniel, on the other hand, was facing his own battles. He had become more than just a detective. He was now a man torn between his mission and the feelings he had for Ava. Loyalty to his profession and the desire to protect her were in constant conflict. He knew that what he would do next would be decisive, not only for him, but also for Ava. What lay ahead was uncertain. Ava might finally begin to rebuild her life, but the repercussions of her escape were not yet over. Daniel, though victorious, would have to find a way to reconcile the two worlds he now lived in. Their future, though now safer, was still a road full of uncertainties. They had won together, but the biggest challenge was yet to come, dealing with what all of this meant for the two of them. In a world where the shadows of the past still haunted them, only time would tell if the peace they had fought so hard for would last. And so, as the danger faded, Ava and Daniel knew that the true test would not only be survival, but learning to live with the consequences of everything they had faced. The future was something to be earned, not without difficulties, but perhaps, finally, with the hope of a new beginning, albeit one slightly altered by the scars of their journey. Now, with the danger finally gone, Ava and Daniel found themselves at a crossroads. What once seemed impossible was now a decision to be made. The external threats had been overcome, but the internal issues, the feelings, the traumas and the choices made, required deep reflection about what the future held for both of them. Ava, after so much suffering and fleeing, still carried the weight of the scars from her past. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The freedom she now had didn't come without a cost, and the shadows of her previous life would continue to haunt her, perhaps for a long time. However, the love that was beginning to bloom between her and Daniel offered a hope she never imagined possible. She knew that, if she could surrender to this new chance, she could finally rebuild her life. But she also understood that she couldn't do it alone. She needed Daniel's help, and he needed something more than just a simple protective mission. He needed trust, a new beginning. Daniel, for his part, knew that the decision he made now would determine the course of his life. As a detective, his duty to the law still called him, but his heart had already become irreversibly intertwined with Ava's. The truth about what he had learned regarding his own role in the web they were both caught in made him question his past choices. Would he be able to maintain his profession while also protecting Ava from what still threatened her? Or would he need to give up everything to ensure she was safe and, finally, happy? After much reflection, it became clear to both of them that their future was not in the hands of others, nor in external factors, but in their own hands. They could choose to move forward, together or apart, but the path ahead would require them both to surrender to an inescapable truth. Love and trust in themselves and each other would be key to overcoming the adversities still to come. Neither of them could carry the weight of the choices they had made alone, and true strength lay in accepting their weaknesses, their failures, and still deciding to continue. And so, together, Ava and Daniel made their final decision. They could no longer live in fear, nor carry the burdens that haunted them alone. They needed each other to move forward, to rebuild not only their lives, but also their love. They knew that, although the future was uncertain, at least they would be ready to face it together. The message left in the air was clear. True strength doesn't come from fighting the world alone, but from finding someone by your side with whom you can share the pain and the victories. Ava and Daniel's journey was proof that even when the shadows seem to dominate, the light of trust and love can guide them to the dawn of a new life. And so, their story, like so many others, showed that even after the greatest challenges, there is always room for a fresh start, always a chance to seek happiness, not just for oneself, but alongside the one you love.